The autumn of 1847 brought with it a particular stillness to Ashford House, the kind that settled over ancient stone and manicured hedges like a held breath. It was the sort of estate that demanded respect, sprawling, immaculate, and bearing the weight of 7 generations with quiet dignity. And at its centre stood Edward Ashford, the 5th Earl of Denmore, a man whose reputation preceded him into every drawing-room in London. He was not handsome in the fashionable sense. His features were too severe, his jaw too firm, his eyes too dark and assessing. But there was something in the way he carried himself, an authority that required neither announcement nor explanation, that made him impossible to ignore. Women whispered about him at balls. Men sought his counsel in Parliament, and yet Edward Ashford remained profoundly, almost deliberately, alone. He preferred it that way. Or so he told himself each morning as he took his coffee in the East Library, surrounded by the portraits of ancestors who had loved once, married well and died with their legacies intact. Love, Edward believed, was a distraction, a weakness, a sentimentality that belonged to poets and fools. It was on such a morning, as he reviewed the estate accounts with his usual precision, that his mother entered unannounced. "Edward," she said, her voice carrying that particular lilt of maternal determination, "we are expecting guests this afternoon." He did not look up. "I was not informed." "You are being informed now." Lady Ashford moved to the window, her silk gown whispering against the Persian rug. "The Reverend Hartley and his daughter have accepted our invitation to stay for the season. You remember Miss Hartley, I trust." Edward's pen paused, though his expression remained unchanged. Vaguely. It was a lie, and they both knew it. He remembered her perfectly. Clara Hartley, the vicar's daughter from the neighbouring parish, a young woman of no particular fortune and even less social. Standing, she had been a fixture at Ashford House during her childhood, often trailing after her father during his pastoral visits. Edward, already a young man of consequence, had scarcely noticed her, save for one peculiar detail. She smiled. Not the practiced, deliberate smiles of London debutantes, but something quieter, something that seemed to exist entirely for her own amusement, as though she were perpetually in on some private joke the world had yet to understand. It had irritated him. Then, it irritated him still, though he could not have said why. "She has been abroad for several years," his mother continued, her tone carefully neutral. "Studying languages and music in Florence, I believe. The Reverend speaks very highly of her accomplishments." "How commendable," Edward replied, returning to his ledger. Lady Ashford's gaze sharpened. "You will attend dinner this evening." It was not a question. They arrived as the afternoon light turned golden, casting long shadows across the entrance hall. Edward stood at the top of the main staircase, observing with the detached interest of a man surveying his own domain. The Reverend Hartley was as Edward remembered, greying, affable, his clerical collar slightly askew, and beside him, Edward's breath caught, though he would sooner have admitted weakness than shown it. Clara Hartley had changed. Gone was the awkward, too-thin girl with paint-stained fingers and an unfortunate tendency to trip over her own skirts. In her place stood a woman, no, a lady, whose composure was absolute. Her travelling dress was simple, a deep sage green that required no embellishment. Her dark hair was arranged with understated elegance, and her eyes, those same grey-green eyes he vaguely recalled, held something he could not quite name. Experience, perhaps, or independence. She looked up as she handed her cloak to the footman, and for one brief, unsettling moment, her gaze met his. She smiled. That same quiet smile, that same infuriating suggestion of private amusement. And then, without acknowledgement, without the expected deference, she turned away and followed his mother toward the drawing-room. Edward descended the stairs slowly, his jaw tight. He did not like being dismissed. Dinner was a study in restraint. The dining room at Ashford House could seat 30 with ease, but tonight's party was intimate, just the family, the Reverend and Miss Hartley. Edward took his place at the head of the table with his customary authority, noting with some annoyance that Clara had been seated to his right, a position typically reserved for honoured guests. His mother's doing, no doubt. "Miss Hartley," he said, his tone impeccably polite, "my mother tells me you have been in Florence. I trust the experience was educational." Clara finished her soup with deliberate grace before responding. "It was transformative, Lord Denmore. I found the Italians to possess a rather remarkable understanding of beauty, not as ornament, but as necessity." Her voice had changed too. It was lower now, measured, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had learned to speak in multiple languages. There was no nervousness, no eagerness to please. "Beauty as necessity," Edward repeated, one dark brow lifting fractionally. "A romantic notion. Is it?" Clara met his gaze directly, and there it was again, that suggestion of amusement dancing at the corners of her mouth. "I should think it rather practical. A society that has forgotten beauty has forgotten what it means to be human." His mother made a small, delighted sound. "How wonderfully put, my dear." Edward said nothing, but he felt something tighten in his chest. It was not anger, precisely. It was something more unsettling. It was interest. He crushed it immediately. "And now you have returned to Derbyshire," he said, his voice cooling by several degrees. "I imagine Florence must seem rather dull in comparison." "Not dull, my lord." Clara accepted a portion of roasted pheasant with a small nod of thanks to the footman. "Merely different. Derbyshire has its own beauty. One need only know where to look." "Indeed." Edward's tone suggested the conversation was concluded. He turned his attention to the Reverend, engaging him in a discussion of parish matters, with the single-minded focus of a man determined to ignore the woman beside him. But he felt her presence with unnerving clarity, the way she held her wine-glass, the rustle of her gown when she shifted. The particular quality of her silence, not awkward or resentful, but perfectly comfortable. She required nothing from him, and that, Edward realized with growing discomfort, was precisely the problem. After dinner, the party withdrew to the music room. It was a tradition at Ashford House, one Edward typically found tedious but endurable. His mother played pianoforte competently. The Reverend could be counted upon to offer a respectable baritone in the old hymns. "Miss Hartley, Lady," Ashford said warmly, "I have been told you studied under Maestro Bellini himself. Would you honor us?" Clara hesitated, a brief flicker of something, reluctance, vulnerability, crossing her features. Then she inclined her head. "If it would please you, Lady Ashford." She moved to the pianoforte with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout dinner. Edward remained standing near the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantel, determined to appear uninterested. Then she began to play. It was Chopin, a nocturne if he wasn't mistaken. The notes fell into the room like rain, each one perfectly placed, and yet the music was not precise. It was alive. It ached. It spoke of longing and memory and things unsaid. Edward's fingers tightened on the marble mantel. He watched her hands move across the keys, watched the candlelight catch in her hair, watched the way her eyes closed briefly, as though the music were drawing something from deep within her. And for reasons he could not explain, and refused to examine, he felt as though he were intruding on something private. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of profound silence. His mother dabbed at her eyes. "Exquisite, my dear. Simply exquisite." Clara rose, and once again, Edward caught that quiet smile. But this time he realized something that sent an odd chill through him. She had not looked at him once. Not during the performance. Not when accepting his mother's praise. Not when she curtsied gracefully and murmured something about the lateness of the hour. She had played as though he were not there, and Edward Ashford, 5th Earl of Denmore, felt the stirrings of something he had not experienced in years. Uncertainty. Later, alone in his study with a glass of brandy he had no appetite for, Edward stood at the window overlooking the east gardens. The moon was full, silvering the hedgerows and casting long shadows across the lawn. He saw her then, Clara, wrapped in a shawl, walking slowly along the gravel path. She had untied her hair and it fell loose down her back, dark against the pale wool. She was looking up at the sky, her face tilted toward the stars, and once again, damn her, she smiled. That quiet, private smile that suggested she needed nothing from anyone. Edward set down his glass with more force than necessary. He had spent years cultivating his indifference, his control. He had built his reputation on certainty, on an absolute understanding of his own nature and desires. He did not lose his composure. He did not feel unsettled, and yet he could not look away. The Earl of Denmore stood in the darkness of his study, watching a woman he had no intention of knowing, and felt the first crack in the armor he had spent a lifetime forging. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself she meant nothing. But even then, in the privacy of his own thoughts, Edward Ashford knew he was lying. The morning arrived with an unseasonable mist that clung to the grounds of Ashford House, like a veil. Edward rose early, as was his custom, and took his usual ride through the estate. The ritual had served him well for years, an hour of solitude before the demands of the day descended, a chance to inspect the land, to ensure order, to maintain control. Control was, after all, what separated men of consequence from those ruled by their impulses. Yet as his horse cantered along the eastern boundary, Edward found his thoughts straying with irritating frequency to the previous evening, to the music room, to Chopin played with such aching proficiency that it had silenced even his mother's habitual chatter, to Clara Hartley's profile in candlelight, serene and somehow untouchable. He had not expected her transformation. More than that, he had not expected to notice it. Edward had spent the better part of his adult life perfecting the art of not noticing the young women paraded before him at balls, not noticing the hopeful glances from ambitious mothers, not noticing the weight of expectation that pressed upon him from every quarter to marry, to produce an heir, to secure the Ashford legacy. He had reasons, good reasons. He simply chose not to dwell upon them. The memory arrived unbidden, as it often did in these early morning hours when his defenses were thinnest. 8 years ago, Edward had been 24, newly ascended to the earldom following his father's sudden death, still raw with grief and responsibility. And there had been Sophia, Lady Sophia, Cavendish. Beautiful, accomplished, charming in that particular way that London society valued above all else. She had seemed perfect, the ideal countess, the appropriate match for a young earl finding his footing. Edward had not loved her, not precisely, but he had believed that affection would come. That duty and compatibility were the proper foundations for marriage. He had been wrong. It was at a summer party at her family's estate in Kent that he had overheard the conversation. He had been searching for her in the gardens, intending to suggest a walk before dinner, when he heard her voice drifting from behind the rose arbor. "The Earl of Denmore? Oh, he is terribly serious, I grant you, and rather cold, but the title is impeccable, and Ashford House." She had laughed, that crystalline laugh he had once found charming. One can endure coldness when compensated by 10,000 a year and a position in society. Her companion, some friend whose name Edward never learned, had giggled in response. But surely there must be some affection. Affection? Sophia's tone had turned contemplative. I suppose there might be eventually. Though I confess I find him rather dull, so very proper, so predictable. One knows exactly what he will say before he says it. Edward had not announced himself. He had simply turned and walked away, his expression unchanged, his bearing unaffected. That evening he had ended the understanding between them with impeccable politeness, citing irreconcilable differences in expectation. Sophia had seemed more relieved than disappointed. The scandal had been minor. These things happened. But what remained, what had burrowed deep into Edward's chest and made a home there, was not heartbreak. It was shame. The shame of having revealed even that small amount of himself, of having begun to imagine a future, of having been so utterly, pathetically transparent that a woman could assess him with such casual dismissal. Dull, predictable, cold. He had vowed then never to be vulnerable again, never to offer himself up for judgment, never to give anyone the power to find him wanting, and for 8 years he had succeeded. Edward returned from his ride to find the household in the gentle chaos of morning preparations. He took breakfast alone in the small dining room, reviewing correspondence with the focused attention that had made him one of the most respected administrators in the county. He had just finished a rather tedious letter from his solicitor when his mother appeared in the doorway. "Edward, a moment, if you would." He set aside his papers with carefully concealed resignation. Of course. Lady Ashford settled into the chair across from him, her morning dress a soft lavender that caught the light. She had been a beauty in her youth, and traces of that loveliness remained, but it was her shrewdness that had always defined her. She saw too much. She always had. "I am taking Miss Hartley into the village this afternoon," she said pleasantly. "The Reverend has business with the bishop, and I thought it would be kind to introduce her to some of the local families. She has been away so long." "How considerate." Edward returned to his correspondence. "I thought you might accompany us. I have estate matters to attend to." "Edward," his mother's voice sharpened fractionally, "when was the last time you went anywhere that was not strictly necessary?" "I prefer it that way." "I am well aware of what you prefer." She paused, and Edward felt the weight of her gaze. "But preference and wisdom are not always aligned. Miss Hartley is our guest. She is the daughter of a man who has served this parish faithfully for 30 years. Common courtesy suggests—" "I am aware of what courtesy suggests." Edward set down his pen with deliberate care. "If my presence is required, I shall attend." His mother smiled, a small knowing curve of her lips that Edward found distinctly unsettling. "Excellent. We depart at 2. The village of Ashford was a collection of honey-coloured stone buildings clustered around a Norman church and a modest high street. Edward had known it all his life. Every shopkeeper, every family, every stone in every wall. It was his responsibility, his burden, his inheritance. He had never particularly enjoyed it. The carriage ride was endurable. His mother filled the silence with observations about the autumn weather, the state of the roads, the upcoming harvest festival. Clara sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze directed toward the window. She seemed content to let his mother's conversation wash over her, offering the occasional murmur of agreement or interest. She did not, Edward noted, attempt to engage him in conversation. He told himself he was grateful for it. When they arrived at the village, his mother embarked upon her social rounds with practiced efficiency. The draper's shop, the milliner, the tea room where Mrs. Patterson held court over the hour, local ladies like a benevolent monarch. At each stop Clara was introduced, greeted with warmth, assessed with curiosity, and Edward, as was his custom, remained in the background, observing, maintaining the appropriate distance, saying little. He watched Clara navigate these introductions with surprising deftness. She remembered names, asked thoughtful questions, listened with genuine attention. There was nothing performative about her courtesy. It seemed to spring from authentic interest rather than social obligation. It was, Edward thought with some irritation, rather admirable. They were leaving the milliner's shop when Clara paused, her attention caught by something across the street. Edward followed her gaze and saw a small girl, perhaps 6 or 7, sitting on the church steps crying. Without hesitation, Clara crossed the street. Edward found himself following, though he could not have said why. "What troubles you, sweetheart?" Clara asked gently, crouching down so she was level with the child. The girl sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I lost my ribbon. Mama gave it to me, and now it's gone, and she'll be ever so cross." "I see." Clara's voice held no condescension, only genuine concern. "And where do you think you might have lost it?" "By the stream, miss. But I'm not allowed to go there alone, and Mama's working at the manor, and—" She dissolved into fresh tears. Clara glanced up at Edward, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked at him directly, really looked at him. Her grey-green eyes held a question, a quiet request. Edward felt something shift in his chest. "The stream is through the east meadow," he heard himself say. "Perhaps we might take a brief detour, if Lady Ashford can spare the time." His mother, who had caught up to them, smiled. "I believe we can manage that." The walk to the stream took only 10 minutes, but it felt longer. Clara kept pace beside him while his mother and the child, who had introduced herself, as Anne, daughter of one of the housemaids, walked slightly ahead. The meadow was golden in the afternoon light, the grass still damp from the morning mist. "That was kind of you," Clara said quietly. Edward kept his gaze forward. It was practical. The child was distressed. Kindness and practicality are not mutually exclusive, Lord Denmore. He glanced at her sharply, but found no mockery in her expression, only that same quiet observation. "You have changed," he said, the words emerging, before he could consider them. "Since you were a child," Clara smiled, that infuriating private smile. "Yes, I imagine that is rather the point of growing up." You were always—" He paused, searching for the appropriate word. "Present. Here. And now you seem different? Self-contained." She considered this. "I suppose Florence taught me that one need not perform for every audience, that it is acceptable, necessary even, to reserve certain parts of oneself." Edward felt an odd tightness in his throat, a philosophy I have long embraced. "I know." She said it simply, without judgment. "I remember." Before he could respond, Anne gave a cry of delight. "I found it! Oh, miss, I found it!" She came running back, clutching a bedraggled blue ribbon, her face alight with relief. Clara took it, examined it gravely, then retied it in the girl's hair with practiced skill. "There, good as new." Anne threw her arms around Clara's waist in spontaneous gratitude, and Edward saw something flicker across Clara's face. Surprise, then tenderness, then a strange sort of wistfulness. She glanced up at him, and for one unguarded moment, he saw past the composure, saw something vulnerable and achingly human. Then it was gone, shuttered behind that quiet smile. That evening, Edward found himself in the library, ostensibly reviewing quarterly reports, but in reality, accomplishing nothing. His mind kept returning to the meadow, to Clara's profile in the golden light, to the way she had looked at that child with such gentleness, such unfeigned compassion, to the way she had looked at him as though she saw something others missed. It unnerved him profoundly. The door opened without preamble, and his mother entered. "I hoped I might find you here," she said, settling into the chair nearest the fire. Edward set aside his papers. "Is there something you require?" "Yes, actually." His mother's gaze was direct. "I require you to stop being such a coward." The word struck him like a physical blow. Edward's expression hardened. "I beg your pardon. You heard me perfectly well." She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentling. "Edward, my darling boy, you have been punishing yourself for 8 years over a woman who was never worthy of you, and in doing so you have denied yourself any possibility of genuine connection. I have no idea. Do not." His mother's tone was sharp. "Do not insult my intelligence or yours. I know what happened with Lady Sophia. I have always known. And I have watched you retreat further and further into this fortress of propriety you have built, this determination to feel nothing." Edward stood abruptly, moving to the window. "I am not discussing this." "Then simply listen." Lady Ashford rose, approaching him with the quiet authority only a mother possesses. "Miss Hartley is an exceptional young woman. She is intelligent, accomplished, kind, and entirely without artifice. She asks nothing of you. She expects nothing. And that, I think, is precisely what terrifies you." "I am not terrified." The words came out more forcefully than he intended. His mother placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Then what are you, my son?" Edward looked down at her, and for one moment allowed his carefully maintained facade to crack. "I am careful, mother, there is a difference." "No, my darling." Her eyes held infinite sadness. "There is not." She left him then, alone with his thoughts and the gathering darkness. Edward returned to the window, looking out over the grounds. And there, once again, as though summoned by his thoughts, was Clara, walking in the garden, her shawl wrapped tight against the evening chill, her face turned toward the last light. She looked peaceful, complete, as though she required nothing beyond this moment, this solitude, this quiet communion with the dusk. And Edward felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in 8 years. Envy, not of what she had, but of who she was. Someone who had learned to be whole unto herself. Someone who had found peace in her own company. Someone who did not need him. The realization should have brought relief. Instead, it brought an ache so profound he had no name for it. Edward Ashford, 5th Earl of Denmore, turned from the window and admitted to himself, only to himself in the privacy of his own mind, what he had been denying since the moment she arrived. He wanted to be noticed by her. He wanted that quiet smile directed at him. He wanted, God help him, to be worthy of her attention, but he had no idea how to earn it, and even less idea how to bear the vulnerability required to try. The following week brought unseasonably fine weather to Derbyshire, and with it an invitation that Edward would have preferred to refuse. Sir Edmund Thornbury, whose estate bordered Ashford lands to the north, was hosting an autumn ball. It was an annual affair, one Edward typically endured with stoic resignation. Sir Edmund was a baronet of moderate consequence, jovial, and well-meaning but prone to excessive hospitality. His gatherings tended toward the crowded and the boisterous, precisely the sort of event Edward found tedious. But his mother had accepted on behalf of the household without consulting him, and courtesy demanded his attendance. "It will be good for you," Lady Ashford announced over breakfast. "You have become far too reclusive." Edward, reviewing the morning's correspondence, did not look up. "I am not reclusive. I am selective. You are ossifying." His mother spread marmalade on her toast with deliberate precision. "And Miss Hartley will need an escort. Her father has been called away to a parish matter, and I cannot very well attend without you." Edward's hand paused fractionally over his letters. "Miss Hartley has agreed to attend?" She expressed delight at the prospect. His mother's tone was carefully neutral. "Apparently she has not attended a proper English ball since before her time in Florence. I believe she is quite looking forward to it." Edward returned to his correspondence, ignoring the odd tightness in his chest. "Then I suppose I have no choice." His mother smiled into her tea. The evening of the ball arrived with all the chaos such events entailed. Edward dressed with his usual precision, dark tailcoat, perfectly tied cravat, his father's watch chain. He stood before the mirror in his dressing room, examining his reflection with critical detachment. Dull, Sophia had called him. Predictable. He pushed the memory aside and descended to the entrance hall. His mother was already there, resplendent in deep blue silk, and beside her, Edward felt the breath leave his lungs. Clara stood in a gown of pale ivory, simple in design, but exquisite in execution. The fabric caught the light as she moved, and her dark hair had been arranged in an elegant chignon that exposed the graceful line of her neck. She wore no jewelry save a single strand of pearls, likely her mother's, and yet she looked more refined than any London debutante draped in diamonds. But it was not the gown that arrested him. It was her expression. She looked happy, genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. Her eyes bright with anticipation, that quiet smile now radiant with pleasure. "Lord Denmore." She curtsied, and Edward found himself bowing with more formality than necessary, as though distance might protect him from the sudden, overwhelming awareness of her presence. "Miss Hartley, you look—" He paused, searching for a word that would not reveal too much. "Well," his mother made a small sound that might have been exasperation. "She looks beautiful, Edward. The appropriate response is to say so." Clara laughed softly. "I am quite content with, well, Lady Ashford. It suggests I might be in good health, which is always preferable to mere aesthetics." Edward offered his arm to his mother, and they proceeded to the waiting carriage. Clara followed, and as she accepted the footman's assistance, Edward caught the faint scent of her perfume, something light and floral, not the heavy, cloying fragrances favoured by London society. Lavender, perhaps, or orange blossom. He forced his attention elsewhere. The journey to Thornbury Hall was brief, filled with his mother's cheerful observations about who would likely attend, which families had recently returned to the country, the usual social calculus that Edward found monumentally uninteresting. But he was aware, painfully, constantly aware, of Clara seated across from him, the way the carriage lamps caught in her hair, the graceful arrangement of her gloved hands, the fact that she seemed entirely at ease, requiring no attention from him, no validation, no performance. It should not have bothered him. It bothered him immensely. Thornbury Hall blazed with light and music. The entrance hall was crowded with arriving guests, a crush of silk and wool, chatter and laughter. Edward navigated through it with practiced efficiency, his mother on his arm, Clara following just behind. They were greeted by Sir Edmund himself, red-faced and jovial as always. "Denmore, Lady Ashford, what a pleasure indeed. And who is this lovely creature?" "Miss Clara Hartley," Edward said, his tone cooling fractionally at the word creature. "Daughter of Reverend Hartley, she has recently returned from Florence." "Florence? How marvellous!" Sir Edmund beamed at Clara with undisguised appreciation. "You must tell me all about it, my dear. I have always harboured a great fondness for Italy. The art, the wine, "The architecture is quite remarkable," Clara interjected smoothly, "though I confess I found the language even more beautiful than the buildings." Sir Edmund laughed heartily, thoroughly charmed. Edward felt his jaw tighten. They proceeded into the ballroom, a vast space already filled with dancers. The orchestra was playing a waltz, and the scene possessed a certain provincial elegance, not London's glittering excess, but something warmer, more genuine. Edward led his mother to a corner where several of the elder ladies had gathered, content to observe rather than participate. He intended to remain there for the duration of the evening, fulfilling his obligation through mere presence. Then he saw him, Captain James Westbrook. The man was crossing the ballroom with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to admiration. He was handsome in that uncomplicated way some men were, fair-haired, blue-eyed, tall, and well-proportioned. He wore his dress uniform, the scarlet coat drawing every eye. He had recently returned from a posting in India, if Edward recalled correctly, and was something of a local celebrity. Edward had always found him insufferable. Westbrook's gaze swept the room, then stopped, fixed, and Edward felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized who had caught the captain's attention. Clara. She was speaking with Mrs. Patterson and several other ladies, animated in a way Edward had not yet seen, describing something with graceful gestures that made the women lean in with rapt attention. She looked radiant, alive, completely unconscious of the attention she was drawing. Westbrook approached with the inevitability of cannon fire. "Miss Hartley, if I'm not mistaken." His voice carried across the space, warm and assured. "Though it has been many years since last we met, I am Captain Westbrook. We were introduced at a parish gathering when you were, perhaps 14. Clara turned and Edward watched her expression shift. Surprise, recognition, then pleasure. "Captain Westbrook, of course I remember. You had just received your commission. How wonderful to see you again." "The pleasure is entirely mine, I assure you." Westbrook executed a perfect bow. "Though I must say the years have been extraordinarily kind. You have become quite the loveliest addition to Derbyshire society." Edward's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Clara laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine. "You are too kind, Captain. I understand you have been in India? That must have been quite the adventure." "Oh, tremendous. Simply tremendous. I should very much like to tell you about it." He extended his hand with practiced gallantry. "If you would do me the honor of this dance." Edward found himself moving before conscious thought directed him. He crossed the space between them with rapid strides, his expression schooled into careful neutrality, even as something hot and unfamiliar churned in his chest. "Miss Hartley's first dance this evening is spoken for," he heard himself say. "I believe." 3 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Westbrook's amused, Clara's startled, and Mrs. Patterson's frankly delighted. Clara recovered first. "Is it, Lord Denmore? I was not aware we had made such an arrangement." "An oversight," Edward said smoothly, extending his hand. "If you would." For one terrible moment, he thought she might refuse, might expose his lie with that same direct honesty she had shown since her arrival, and he would deserve it. This transparent attempt to what? Claim her, protect her from Westbrook's obvious interest? The realization of what he was doing struck him with uncomfortable force, but Clara, after the briefest hesitation, placed her hand in his. "Of course, Lord Denmore. How forgetful of me." Edward led her onto the dance floor, acutely aware of his mother's approving smile and Westbrook's knowing smirk. He positioned them for the waltz with mechanical precision, one hand at Clara's waist, the other cradling her gloved fingers. The music began. They moved together with surprising ease. Clara was an excellent dancer, her steps confident and graceful. Edward had been taught by the finest masters, and his technique was, as always, flawless. But for the first few rotations, neither spoke. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "That was quite bold of you, Lord Denmore." "Was it?" Edward kept his tone neutral, his gaze fixed, somewhere over her shoulder. "I merely thought to spare you from Westbrook's attentions. He can be rather persistent. And you assumed I would find his attentions unwelcome?" The question held no anger, only genuine curiosity. Edward forced himself to look at her and found her watching him with those clear, assessing eyes. "I assumed nothing," he said stiffly. "I merely acted on instinct." Instinct. She repeated the word thoughtfully. How interesting. I should not have thought you a man. Governed by instinct, my lord. You seem far too deliberate for that. Edward had no response. She was right, of course. He was never governed by instinct. He was governed by careful calculation, by reason, by the absolute suppression of anything that might resemble spontaneity, except apparently when it came to her. Captain Westbrook seems a pleasant gentleman, Clara continued, her tone carefully neutral. Quite charming. Something sharp twisted in Edward's chest. He is known for his charm. Is that a warning, Lord Denmore? An observation? They turned in perfect synchronization, and Edward became aware of how close they were, how his hand spanned her waist, how her perfume, yes, definitely orange blossom, surrounded him, how for the first time since Sophia, he was touching a woman and feeling something other than distant politeness. He was feeling possessive. The realization horrified him. I do not require protection from charm, Clara said quietly. I spent 2 years in Florence, my lord. I have encountered charm in far more sophisticated forms than Captain Westbrook's amiable gallantry. I am sure you have. And yet you felt compelled to intervene. Edward met her gaze directly. Yes. Why? The question hung between them, as dangerous as any blade. Edward knew the answer, had known it since he watched her playing Chopin, since he saw her tie a ribbon in a child's hair, since he stood at his window night after night, watching her walk in the garden with that quiet, self-contained peace he both envied and desired. But he could not say it, could not make himself that vulnerable, could not risk being found wanting again. So instead he said, "Because you are my mother's guest, and therefore under my protection." Something flickered across Clara's face, disappointment perhaps, or resignation. The light dimmed fractionally from her eyes. "I see," she said softly. "How very proper of you." The waltz ended. Edward released her with relief and something that felt uncomfortably like regret. He bowed, she curtsied, and they parted with perfect correctness. He escorted her back to where his mother stood, then retreated to the far side of the ballroom, accepting a glass of port from a passing footman and positioning himself where he could observe without participating. And he watched as Westbrook immediately claimed Clara for the next dance, watched as she laughed at something he said, watched as other men Edward had known all his life, men he had never thought twice about, began to orbit around her during the interval, drawn by her warmth, her intelligence, her complete lack of artifice. She was besieged with invitations. The quadrille, the country dance, another waltz. She accepted them all with gracious pleasure, moving from partner to partner with that same radiant happiness he had seen earlier. And not once did she look for him. Edward stood in the shadows, his port untouched, and felt something he had not experienced since he was a boy. Jealousy, raw, irrational, consuming jealousy. He watched Westbrook whisper something in Clara's ear during their second dance together, watched her throw back her head and laugh with unself-conscious delight, watched the captain's hand rest with familiar ease at her waist, his smile confident and assured, and Edward, who prided himself on his control, on his careful management of every emotion, felt that control begin to fracture, because Clara Hartley was not his, had never been his, had given him absolutely no indication that she wished to be his. And yet, he could not bear to watch her smile at another man, could not endure seeing her happiness directed elsewhere, could not tolerate the way Westbrook looked at her, with open admiration, with easy affection, with the kind of uncomplicated interest that Edward had spent years teaching himself not to feel. The evening stretched on with excruciating slowness. Edward danced once with a local squire's daughter out of obligation, spoke briefly with several gentlemen about estate matters, maintained the appearance of perfect composure even as something dark and unfamiliar coiled tighter and tighter in his chest. Near midnight, he found Clara standing alone on the terrace, taking air. The music drifted out from the ballroom, and the October night was cold enough that her breath misted faintly. Edward approached without announcing himself, moving to stand beside her at the balustrade. "You are popular this evening," he said, keeping his tone carefully neutral. Clara glanced at him, then back at the darkened gardens. "People are kind. Westbrook especially so." She smiled, but it was that private smile again, The one that suggested she was amused by something he could not see. Yes, he has been very attentive. Too attentive. Now she turned to face him fully, her expression impossible to read in the dim light. "And why should that concern you, Lord Denmore?" "It does not concern me." The lie tasted bitter. "I merely observe that he has a reputation." "For what? Charm? Gallantry? Good humour?" Clara's tone remained pleasant, but Edward detected steel beneath the silk. "These seem like commendable qualities in a gentleman." "He is shallow." "And what would you prefer?" "Depth." She took a small step closer, and Edward caught the scent of orange blossom again, stronger now. "Tell me, my lord, what does depth look like to you? Is it silence? Is it the careful withholding of every genuine feeling? Is it the determination never to risk vulnerability, never to show kindness unless it can be justified as mere practicality?" Edward felt as though he had been struck. "Miss Hartley, I am not a fool, Lord Denmore." Her voice remained soft, but the words cut like crystal. "I see you. I have always seen you, and I know precisely what you are doing." "And what is that?" "Punishing yourself." She said it with such certainty, such clear-eyed understanding, that Edward felt his carefully maintained defenses crack further. "For something. I do not know what. But you have built such a fortress around yourself that you cannot recognize genuine connection when it is offered. You mistake isolation for strength, loneliness for dignity. You know nothing about me." The words came out harsher than he intended. "I know more than you think." Clara held his gaze steadily. "But what I know does not matter, does it? Because you have decided that feeling. Wanting anything is weakness, and you would rather be alone than weak." Edward had no response, could not form words past the tightness in his throat. Clara turned away, looking back toward the ballroom where music and laughter continued unabated. "Captain Westbrook has asked if he might call upon me. I have given him permission to do so." The words struck Edward with physical force. He gripped the stone balustrade, his knuckles white. "I see. Do you?" Clara asked quietly. "Do you see, Lord Denmore? Because from where I stand you see nothing at all." She walked back inside, leaving Edward alone on the terrace. He stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through his evening clothes, watching the light from the ballroom spill across the flagstones. His chest ached with something he could not name and refused to examine. Inside he could hear the music, could picture Clara dancing with Westbrook again, laughing at his jokes, enjoying his uncomplicated attention. And Edward Ashford, who had spent 8 years perfecting the art of feeling nothing, discovered that he had failed entirely, because what he felt now, watching her slip away, knowing he had driven her toward another man through his own stubborn pride, was not nothing. It was everything, and he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The morning after the ball arrived with grey skies and the promise of rain. Edward had not slept. He had remained in his study until dawn, nursing brandy he did not see, drink and contemplating decisions he could not unmake. The memory of Clara laughing in Westbrook's arms played behind his eyes with relentless clarity. The ease between them, the uncomplicated joy. Everything Edward had convinced himself he did not want, did not need, now seemed the only thing that mattered, and he had driven her toward it. He rose mechanically, dressed with his usual precision, and descended to breakfast, determined to maintain the facade of normalcy. His mother was already at table, reading correspondence. Clara sat across from her, wearing a simple morning dress of pale green, her attention focused on her tea. She did not look at him when he entered. "Good morning," Edward said, his voice carefully neutral. His mother glanced up with a knowing expression that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Good morning, Edward. You look dreadful." "I am perfectly well." "Of course you are." Lady Ashford returned to her letters with a small smile. "Miss Hartley, Captain Westbrook, has sent a note requesting permission to call this afternoon. I have taken the liberty of accepting on your behalf." Edward's hand tightened on his coffee cup. Clara's expression remained serene. "That is very kind, Lady Ashford. The captain is excellent company." "Indeed he is." His mother's tone was warm. So very different from men who are all reserve and no warmth. Edward met his mother's gaze and saw the deliberate challenge there. She was pushing him, forcing his hand. He hated that it was working. "Miss Hartley," he heard himself say, his voice harder than intended. "Might I have a word with you?" "Privately." Clara set down her tea with careful precision. "I cannot imagine what we would have to discuss, Lord Denmore. Nevertheless, I insist." Something flickered in her eyes, anger perhaps, or hurt, but she rose gracefully. "Very well, if you insist." They walked in silence through the corridors to his study. Edward closed the door behind them with more force than necessary, then turned to find Clara standing in the center of the room, her posture perfect, her expression closed. "You wish to speak with me," she said. Not a question. Edward found himself at a loss. What had he meant to say? What could he say that would not reveal too much, risk too much, expose him to the judgment he had spent 8 years avoiding? "Westbrook is not appropriate for you," he finally said. Clara's eyebrows rose fractionally. "I beg your pardon?" "He is shallow. His interest is superficial. He does not—" Edward stopped, aware he was treading into dangerous territory. "He does not what, Lord Denmore?" Clara's voice remained calm, but steel had entered it. "Appreciate me? Value me? See me as anything more than an ornament? He does not know you. And you do?" The question was quiet but devastating. "You, who have spent 2 weeks avoiding any genuine conversation? You, who treat every exchange as a duty to be endured? You, who made it abundantly clear that I am nothing, more than your mother's guest requiring protection as an obligation?" Edward felt the words like physical blows. "That is not—" "What, precisely?" Clara took a step closer, and Edward saw that she was trembling, not with fear, but with suppressed emotion. "Not true, not fair, not what you meant?" "You do not understand. Then explain it to me." Her grey-green eyes blazed. "Explain why you dance with me only to prevent another man from doing so. Why you watch me from shadows but refuse to approach. Why you treat me with formal coldness in company but look at me as though—" She stopped abruptly, color rising in her cheeks. "As though what?" Edward's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Clara looked away, her composure cracking. "As though I matter. As though you feel something, and then you deny it so completely that I question whether I imagined it entirely." The vulnerability in her voice undid something in Edward's carefully maintained defenses. He moved closer, drawn by an impulse he could not name and did not resist. "You did not imagine it," he said roughly. Clara's eyes snapped back to his face, wide with surprise. "You did not imagine it," Edward repeated, the words coming faster now, 8 years of restraint fracturing with each syllable. "I have been watching you since the moment you arrived. I have thought of nothing but you, your smile, your music, the way you move through the world as though you need nothing from anyone, and it terrifies me." "Why?" The word was barely audible. "Because I do not know how to want something without controlling it. Because every instinct I possess tells me to protect myself, to maintain distance, to never—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I was engaged once, 8 years ago, to a woman I believed appropriate. I overheard her discussing me with a friend, cataloguing my deficiencies, my coldness, my predictability, the compensating factors of my title and fortune." Understanding dawned in Clara's eyes, along with something that looked like pain. "So I learned," Edward continued, his voice harsh, "that vulnerability is weakness, that caring is dangerous, that it is safer to feel nothing than to risk being found wanting. And you have been alone ever since." "Yes." Clara was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. "And what of me, Lord Denmore? What am I in this carefully ordered world you have constructed?" "You are chaos," Edward said, and the word held no malice, only wonder. "You are everything I told myself I did not need, everything I convinced myself I could not have, everything I—" He stopped, the confession too large, too raw. "Everything you what?" Clara asked softly. Edward looked at her, really looked at her, allowing himself to see what he had been denying. The intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her bearing, the quiet grace that required no validation, no performance, the completeness unto herself that he both envied and desperately wished to be part of. "Everything I want," he finished, his voice breaking on the last word. Clara's breath caught. For one suspended moment, Edward thought she might close the distance between them, thought she might offer him the connection he had just confessed to craving. Instead, she shook her head slowly, tears gathering in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "No, Edward. That is not enough." The use of his Christian name, spoken for the first time, was both intimacy and farewell. "Clara, do you know what I want?" she continued, her voice trembling but determined. "I want someone who chooses me, not someone who wants me despite themselves, not someone who views their own feelings as weakness to be overcome, not someone who can only confess desire when driven by jealousy and pride. That is not fair. Is it not?" Clara's tears spilled over, but her gaze remained steady. "You stand here and tell me you want me, but you have done nothing, to show me that want. You have hidden, you have withdrawn. And when another man showed me kindness, showed me attention, you responded not with honesty but with possession. I am trying what? To control your own heart as you control everything else." She wiped at her tears with angry swipes. "I spent 2 years in Florence learning who I was apart from anyone's expectations, learning to value myself, learning that I deserve more than being someone's reluctant desire, and I cannot, accept less." Edward felt as though the ground was dissolving beneath him. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I deserve to be loved without reservation, without shame, without the man who claims to want me treating that want as a character flaw." Clara's voice steadied, gaining strength. "Captain Westbrook may be simpler. He may lack your depth, your complexity, but he sees me and smiles. He enjoys my company without treating it as a burden. And perhaps that is worth more than tortured longing from a man too proud to act on it." "You cannot mean that." Edward heard the desperation in his own voice and hated it. "I do mean it." Clara moved toward the door, her carriage regal despite her tears. "You were right about one thing, Lord Denmore. I have changed. I am no longer the girl who would accept crumbs of attention and call it affection. I know my worth now, and I will not diminish it for any man, no matter how much I might wish circumstances were different." She reached for the door handle, and Edward felt panic rise in his chest. "Clara, please." She turned back, and the expression on her face broke something in him. It was not anger, not triumph. It was sorrow, deep, genuine sorrow, for what might have been and now would not be. "Goodbye, Edward," she said quietly. "I hope someday you learn that being vulnerable is not weakness, that letting someone see you, truly see you, is not defeat. That love, real love, requires courage you have not yet found." And then she was gone, the door closing with terrible finality. Edward stood alone in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his consequence, the mahogany desk, the leather-bound books, the portraits of stern ancestors who had loved and lost and survived. All the weight of his title, his legacy, his carefully constructed life, and none of it mattered, because she was right. He had been a coward, and by the time he found the courage to act, it might be too late. The rain began that afternoon, a steady autumn downpour that turned the grounds of Ashford House into a watercolor of grey and brown. Edward watched from the library windows as Captain Westbrook's carriage arrived precisely at 3. He forced himself to remain where he was, forced himself not to descend, forced himself to endure the sound of Clara's laughter drifting up from the drawing room, bright and genuine, and not for him. His mother found him there 2 hours later, standing in the same position, his untouched correspondence spread across the desk behind him. "He has asked permission to court her formally," Lady Ashford said without preamble. Edward's jaw tightened, but he did not turn from the window. "And what did you say?" "I said that the decision was Miss Hartley's, not mine, and that I would support whatever choice brought her happiness." "How diplomatic." "Edward." His mother's voice gentled. "She is leaving." Now he turned, feeling something cold settle in his chest. "What?" "She has asked to return to her father's house. She feels, and I cannot disagree, that remaining here has become uncomfortable." Lady Ashford moved closer, her expression troubled. "She will depart tomorrow morning." "No." The word emerged with more force than Edward intended. "She cannot." "She can, and she will, and you have no standing to prevent it." His mother's gaze was direct. "What did you say to her this morning?" Edward turned back to the window, unable to bear the weight of her scrutiny. "The truth." "Which truth?" "The comfortable lie you have been telling yourself for 8 years, or the genuine truth you are too frightened to face?" I told her—" Edward stopped, his hands clenching behind his back. "I told her I wanted her, and she refused me." "Did she?" Lady Ashford's tone suggested she knew otherwise. Or did she refuse to accept wanting without action? Desire without courage? Confession without commitment? Edward had no response. His mother sighed, a sound filled with infinite maternal patience. "My darling boy, you are the most intelligent, most capable man I know. You manage this estate with precision. You are respected in Parliament. You are admired by your peers. And yet, when it comes to matters of the heart, you have the emotional sophistication of a frightened child." "Mother, no, you will listen." Steel entered her voice. "Your father was a difficult man, proud, stern, demanding. And when he died so suddenly, you took upon yourself not just his responsibilities, but his entire character, as though becoming him would somehow honor his memory. But Edward—" She placed a hand on his arm. "He loved your mother, loved me, and he was not ashamed of it. He did not hide it. He did not treat it as weakness." Edward felt something crack in his chest. "He never showed it. To you, perhaps, because he believed men of consequence did not display softness to their sons. But I knew. I felt it every day in 1,000 small ways." Her eyes glistened. "And when he died, I watched you shut down every warm impulse you possessed. Watched you transform into marble. Watched you decide that feeling nothing was safer than feeling too much. After Sophia Cavendish was a shallow mercenary girl who did not deserve your regard, and you have let her casual cruelty dictate your life for 8 years." Lady Ashford's voice hardened. "But Clara Hartley is not Sophia. She is worth 10 of that woman. And if you let pride and fear drive her away, you will regret it for the rest of your life." Edward closed his eyes, the truth of his mother's words settling over him like a physical weight. "I do not know how to be what she needs," he said quietly. "Then learn." His mother squeezed his arm. "Be brave enough to try. Be humble enough to fail and try again. Be human enough to admit that you need her." "What if I am not capable of it?" "You are." Lady Ashford's certainty was absolute. "But only if you choose to be. Only if you value her more than your pride. Only if you love her more than you fear being hurt." She left him then, and Edward remained at the window as the rain continued to fall. Love. His mother had said the word so easily, but Edward had not allowed himself to think it, had not permitted that particular truth to take shape in his mind. But standing there in the grey afternoon light, watching the rain obscure the gardens where Clara walked each evening, Edward finally admitted what he had been denying since the moment she played Chopin in the music room. He loved her. Not wanted. Not desired. Not merely admired. Loved. Loved her quiet strength. Loved her independence. Loved the way she smiled as though joy were her natural state. Loved her kindness to small children. Loved her music. Loved her intelligence. Loved the way she had seen through his defenses and called him out with perfect honesty. Loved her completely, desperately, with an intensity that terrified him precisely because it made him vulnerable. And he had told her none of it, had hidden behind pride and fear and 8-year-old wounds, had treated his own feelings as shameful, had offered her wanting when she deserved devotion. Edward moved to his desk, pulling out paper with shaking hands. He would write to her, would explain, would find the words that had eluded him that morning. But as he sat with pen poised, the words would not come, because words on paper were still safe, still controlled, still a way of maintaining distance while claiming vulnerability. And Clara deserved more. She deserved action, deserved courage, deserved a man willing to stand before her and risk everything. Edward set down the pen. Tomorrow she would leave, would return to her father's house, would begin entertaining Westbrook's courtship with its easy affection and uncomplicated warmth. And Edward would be left here alone in his carefully ordered world, with nothing but regret and the memory of a quiet smile that had undone him completely. That evening, Edward could not bear to join dinner. He sent his apologies, claiming estate business, and remained in his study with brandy. He finally did drink, and thoughts that grew increasingly tortured as the hours passed. Near midnight, unable to endure his own company any longer, he found himself wandering the darkened corridors of Ashford House. His footsteps led him without conscious direction to the music room. The pianoforte stood silent in the shadows, its ivory keys gleaming faintly in the moonlight, filtering through tall windows. Edward moved to it, slowly, running his fingers across those keys without pressing them, remembering the way Clara's hands had moved here, the way the music had seemed to come from somewhere deep within her, the way he had felt, listening, as though she were offering him something precious, and he had been too blind to see it. "I thought I might find you here." Edward spun to find Clara in the doorway, wrapped in a dressing gown, her hair loose down her back. She looked young and impossibly beautiful, and so far, beyond his reach. "I could not sleep," he said unnecessarily. "Nor could I." She moved into the room but maintained her distance, as though an invisible line had been drawn between them. "I wanted to apologize for what I said this morning. It was harsh. It was true. Truth and kindness are not mutually exclusive, Lord Denmore. I could have been gentler." "Edward," he said quietly, "when we are alone, please, call me Edward." Something softened in her expression, but sadness remained. "Very well, Edward." The sound of his name on her lips was both balm and wound. "I do not want you to leave," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know I have no right to ask you to stay. I know I have given you every reason to go. But the thought of this house without you in it, the thought of not seeing you in the gardens, not hearing your music, not—" He stopped, overwhelmed. "Not what?" Clara asked softly. "Not having the chance to become the man worthy of you." Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Oh, Edward, I am not asking you to wait for me. I am not asking for promises. I am only asking—" His voice broke. "Do not close the door entirely. Do not let Westbrook claim what I was too cowardly to reach for. Give me time. Give me the chance to learn how to be brave." Clara was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the shadows. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "I cannot do that." Edward felt the words like a blade. "Not because I do not care," she continued quickly, "but because what you are asking, it is not fair. Not to me and not to you. I do not understand. You want me to wait while you learn how to love me without shame, while you overcome 8 years of self-protection, while you slowly, carefully decide whether I am worth the risk." Clara shook her head. "But Edward, I cannot be a goal you work toward, a prize you earn once you have conquered your own fears. I need to be chosen, now, as I am, despite your fear, not after you have resolved it." "But I am choosing you," Edward protested. "That is what I am trying to say." "No." Clara's voice held infinite sadness. "You are choosing the idea of trying, and that is not the same thing." She moved toward the door, and Edward felt panic rise in his throat. "Clara, please, I leave tomorrow morning," she said without turning. "I think it is best that we say goodbye now, cleanly, without prolonging pain for either of us. This is not—" "Goodbye." Edward heard the desperation in his voice and could not care. "I will not accept that." Clara turned back and the moonlight caught the tears on her cheeks. "Then what would you have me do, Edward? Wait indefinitely while you decide whether loving me is worth the vulnerability? Watch you from a distance, hoping that someday you will find the courage I need you to have now?" She wiped at her tears. "I deserve more than that, and deep down, you know I do." She was right. She was. Absolutely, devastatingly right, and Edward had no counter-argument, no plan, no solution beyond the desperate wish that time could reverse, that he could go back to the moment she arrived and approach everything differently. But time moved only forward, and he had wasted too much of it already. "I am sorry," he said finally, his voice hollow, "for all of it, for not being what you need, for failing you." Clara's expression softened with something that might have been affection or might have been pity. "You did not fail me, Edward, you failed yourself." She offered him a sad smile. "But perhaps someday you will learn. And when you do, I hope it brings you peace." She left then, her footsteps fading down the corridor, and Edward stood alone in the music room with nothing but silence and the ghost of Chopin, and the certainty that he had just lost something irreplaceable. He had been right, all those years ago, to protect himself, because this agony was precisely what he had feared. The only thing worse than never having had her would be living the rest of his life knowing he might have, If only he had been brave enough to try. 3 weeks passed like 3 lifetimes. Edward threw himself into estate business with manic intensity. He reviewed every account, inspected every tenant farm, attended every meeting in London that he had previously avoided. He worked from dawn until long past midnight, as though exhaustion might serve as anesthetic to the constant, aching awareness of Clara's absence. It did not work. Everything reminded him of her. The garden paths where she had walked, the music room he now avoided entirely, the drawing room where her laughter had once filled the air. Even the library, his sanctuary, felt hollow without the possibility that she might appear in the doorway. His mother watched him with worried eyes but said nothing. There was nothing to say. Clara had gone home to her father's modest vicarage, and Captain Westbrook, Edward, learned through social channels he suddenly paid far too much attention to, had been calling regularly. The thought of it made Edward physically ill, but what right did he have to object? What claim could he make? He had been offered a chance and had responded with half measures and fear. Clara owed him nothing, and yet he could not let it go, could not accept that this was the end, could not reconcile himself to a future where she smiled for someone else, played music for someone else, shared her quiet joy with a man who had not been too cowardly to reach for it when offered. It was his mother who finally forced the issue. Edward was in his study late one November afternoon, reviewing figures he had already reviewed twice when she entered without knocking. "This has gone on long enough," Lady Ashford announced. Edward did not look up. "I do not know what you mean. You are miserable. You are making everyone around you miserable, and you are wasting time you do not have." She crossed to his desk and physically removed the ledger from his hands. "Captain Westbrook has formally proposed to Clara." Edward's head snapped up, his face draining of colour. "What?" "He proposed yesterday evening. The entire village is talking about it." His mother's expression was stern. "She has asked for time to consider his offer." "She has not accepted?" Hope, irrational and desperate, flared in Edward's chest. "Not yet, but she will." Lady Ashford leaned forward, her hands flat on the desk. "Unless you give her a reason not to." Edward stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the November landscape was grey and bare, trees stripped of their leaves, the garden beds dormant until spring. Everything felt dead. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice raw. "Ride to her house and declare myself? Compete with Westbrook's uncomplicated affection like some character in a Gothic novel? Make grand gestures and empty promises?" "Yes," his mother said simply. "Exactly. That." Edward turned to stare at her. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious." Lady Ashford moved to stand beside him. "Edward, my darling boy, you think grand gestures are beneath you. You think emotional displays are weakness. You think declaring your feelings openly is somehow shameful. But you are wrong." "Am I?" "Yes." Her voice gentled. "Because love, real love, requires exactly that kind of vulnerability. It requires you to stand before another person and say, 'I choose you. I need you. I cannot imagine my life without you.' It requires you to risk rejection, risk pain, risk being found wanting, because the alternative is living half a life." Edward felt his throat tighten. "And if she refuses me? Then at least you will know you tried. At least you will have been brave enough to fight for her." His mother placed a hand on his arm. "But if you do nothing, if you let pride and fear keep you silent, you will spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. And that, my son, is a far worse fate than any rejection." Edward looked down at his mother, seeing in her face the same determination that had carried her through his father's death, through years of managing estates and social obligations, through all the challenges that life had presented. She was right. She had been right all along. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "Then learn as you go." Lady Ashford smiled. "Be honest, be humble. Be willing to make a fool of yourself if necessary. Show her that she is worth more to you than your pride. What if it is too late? Then you will have tried, and that is all anyone can ask." She squeezed his arm. "But Edward, I do not think it is too late. Not if you act now. Not if you show her the man I know you can be." Edward did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, composing and discarding a dozen different approaches. Should he write first? Send a formal request to call? Simply appear? Every option seemed inadequate. By dawn he had made a decision. No elaborate planning, no carefully crafted speeches, just honesty, raw and unpolished. He would go to her. Today. Now. Edward dressed with shaking hands, selecting his clothing with none of his usual precision. He took his fastest horse, refusing the carriage that would have been more appropriate, driven by an urgency he could not contain. The ride to the vicarage took 40 minutes. 40 minutes during which Edward's mind raced through every possible scenario, every potential outcome. She might refuse to see him. She might have already accepted Westbrook. She might listen politely and then explain with devastating kindness that his moment had passed. All of it was possible. All of it was preferable to inaction. The vicarage appeared through the bare trees, a modest stone building with a tidy garden and smoke rising from the chimney. Edward dismounted, tied his horse, and stood for one moment gathering himself. Then he knocked. The housekeeper answered, her eyes widening in surprise. "Lord Denmore, we were not expecting—" "I need to speak with Miss Hartley," Edward said, his voice brooking no argument. "Please, it is urgent." The housekeeper hesitated, then nodded. "I will see if she is receiving callers, my lord. If you would wait in the parlour." Edward entered the modest room, too agitated to sit. He paced, his heart hammering, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. Minutes passed like hours. Then he heard footsteps, and Clara appeared in the doorway. She wore a simple day dress of grey wool, her hair arranged simply, no adornment save a small cameo at her throat. She looked tired, Edward thought. Shadows beneath her eyes suggested she had slept as poorly as he had. "Lord Denmore," she said quietly, "this is unexpected." "Edward," he corrected automatically. "Please." Clara did not move further into the room. "My father is at the church. The housekeeper is just in the next room. It would not be proper." "I do not care about proper." The words emerged with more force than he intended. "Clara, I need to speak with you. And if that is improper, if it causes scandal, if it violates every social convention we possess, I do not care." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest hint of hope. "Very well," she said. "Speak." Edward realized he had no prepared words, no elegant phrases, nothing but the desperate truth that had been consuming him for 3 weeks. "I was wrong," he began, "about everything, about what I needed, about what I feared, about you." Clara remained silent, waiting. "I told you I wanted you, and you said it was not enough. You were right. Wanting is passive. Wanting is safe. Wanting allows me to maintain distance while claiming desire." Edward took a step closer. "But that is not what I feel. It has never been what I feel." "Then what do you feel, Edward?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I love you." The words fell into the space, between them simple and enormous. "I love you," Edward repeated, his voice gaining strength. "I have loved you since you played Chopin, since I watched you tie a ribbon in a child's hair, since you walked in the garden with that quiet smile that suggested you needed nothing from anyone. I love your strength, your kindness, your intelligence, your independence. I love that you are complete unto yourself. And I love that despite all my efforts to remain distant, despite every defense I erected, you saw through all of it." Tears gathered in Clara's eyes, but she did not speak. "I am not asking you to wait for me to become brave," Edward continued, the words tumbling out now. "I am telling you that I am choosing to be brave. Now. Today. Not someday in the distant future after I have carefully conquered my fears. Now standing here, terrified and vulnerable and entirely at your mercy. Edward, I know Westbrook has proposed. I know he is everything I am not. Warm, uncomplicated, easy. I know he would give you a life without shadows, without this constant battle against pride and fear. And if that is what you want, if that is what you need, I will accept it. I will let you go. I will find a way to endure it." He moved closer still, close enough to see the tears on her cheeks, the rapid rise and fall of her breath. "But before you decide," he said, his voice breaking, "I need you to know that I will spend every day for the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of you. I will learn to be open, to be vulnerable, to share what I feel without shame. I will stumble, I will fail. I will undoubtedly be frustrating and stubborn and retreat into old habits, but I will try. Clara, God help me, I will try. Why? Clara asked, her voice thick with tears. Why now? What has changed? Nothing has changed. Edward reached for her hand, trembling as his fingers closed around hers. I have always felt this way. I was simply too much of a coward to say it, too frightened of being hurt, too proud to risk being found wanting. But these past 3 weeks without you... His voice broke entirely, and Edward found he could not continue, could not find words for the desolation, the constant ache, the way everything had lost color and meaning. Clara's free hand came up to his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "Oh, Edward," she whispered. "I cannot offer you perfection," he said roughly. "I cannot promise that I will always get this right, but I can promise that I will try, that I will choose you every day, every moment, for the rest of my life if you will let me." "And if I say yes?" Clara asked, her thumb brushing away a tear he had not realized he had shed. "If I choose you, will you retreat again at the first sign of difficulty? Will you hide behind propriety and pride the moment vulnerability becomes uncomfortable?" "I might," Edward admitted, the honesty costing him but necessary. "Old habits are difficult to break." "But Clara," he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "If I do, call me on it. Challenge me. Refuse to accept less than what you deserve. I do not need a wife who will accept my failures with silent resignation. I need someone who will fight for us, for me, even when I am too stubborn to fight for myself." Clara laughed, the sound breaking on a sob. "That is the most unconventional proposal I have ever heard." "It is not a proposal," Edward said. "Not yet. First you need to refuse Westbrook. First you need to be free, and then..." He took a shaking breath. "Then if you will allow it, I would like to court you properly, with all the attention and devotion I should have shown from the beginning." "Court me?" Clara repeated, a smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, I want to walk with you in gardens. I want to sit beside you while you play music. I want to know everything, your favorite books, your thoughts on philosophy, what you loved about Florence, what you hope for the future. I want to earn you, Clara. Not claim you out of jealousy or pride, but actually earn the privilege of your affection. You are asking permission to woo me." There was wonder in her voice now, and something that might have been joy. "Yes." Edward managed a self-deprecating smile. "I realize it is rather backwards. Most men propose first. But I want to do this right. I want you to have every opportunity to know me, truly know me, before making any decision. I want to prove through action rather than words that I am capable of the openness you need." Clara was silent for a long moment, her grey-green eyes searching his face. Edward stood still, barely breathing, allowing her to see everything, the fear, the hope, the desperate love he could no longer hide. "I have not accepted Captain Westbrook," she said finally. Edward felt his heart stutter. "You have not?" "No. I told him I needed time. Because despite everything, despite your stubbornness and pride and maddening tendency to hide, I could not. Imagine marrying him while feeling this way about you. And how do you feel about me?" Edward dared to ask. Clara's smile was radiant even through her tears. "I love you, you impossible man. I have been in love with you since I was 14 years old, and you kindly rescued my sketches from the mud, even though you clearly thought me a nuisance. And returning from Florence, seeing you again, it all came rushing back, only stronger, deeper. Then why did you refuse me? Because loving you when you could not love yourself, when you treated your own feelings as shameful, would have destroyed us both." Clara's fingers tightened around his. "But this, what you are offering now, this is different. It is everything," Edward said. "You are everything, and I will spend my life proving it." Clara studied him for another moment, then stepped closer, closing the remaining distance between them. "Then yes, Edward Ashford, you have my permission to court me, to walk with me, to talk with me, to show me the man behind the Earl's stern facade." "And at the end of that courtship," Edward asked, hardly daring to hope, "if I succeed, if I prove worthy, might there be a chance that you would consider marrying you?" Clara finished, her eyes dancing. "That depends entirely on how well you woo me, my lord." Edward laughed, actually laughed for the first time in 3 weeks. "Then I shall have to be very persuasive." "Yes," Clara agreed. "You shall." For a moment they simply stood there, hands clasped, both tearful and smiling. The space between them finally closed not by passion but by honesty. Then Clara leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, gentle and brief and perfect. When she pulled back, Edward was stunned. "I thought you said we should court first." "We should." Clara's smile turned mischievous, that same quiet smile that had undone him from the beginning. "But I wanted you to know what you are working toward. Incentive, if you will." Edward pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of orange blossom and feeling, for the first time in 8 years, completely at peace. "I love you," he whispered. "I know," Clara replied. "And this time, I believe you." 6 months later, in the spring of 1848, Edward Ashford, 5th Earl of Denmore, married Clara Hartley in the small Norman church that served Ashford parish. It was not a grand London wedding with hundreds of guests. It was intimate. Family, close friends, the villagers who had known them both for years. The bride wore ivory silk and orange blossoms in her hair. The groom managed to say his vows without retreating into formality, his voice thick with emotion as he promised to love, honor, and cherish the woman beside him. And when the vicar pronounced them married, when Edward kissed his wife before God and witnesses, there were no shadows of doubt, no lingering fears, only joy. Lady Ashford wept throughout the ceremony, though whether from happiness or relief, even she could not say. Captain Westbrook attended with good grace, having recovered from his disappointment with commendable speed and already showing marked attention to the eldest Miss Patterson. But it was Clara's smile, that quiet, radiant smile that everyone would remember, the smile that said she had found exactly what she needed. Not a perfect man, but a brave one. Not a man without flaws, but a man willing to face them. Not a man who loved easily, but a man who loved deeply, completely, with everything he had. And Edward, standing beside her as they greeted their guests, felt the last of his carefully constructed armor fall away. He had spent 8 years protecting himself from precisely this vulnerability, this terrifying, overwhelming, absolute exposure of his heart. And now, holding Clara's hand as she laughed at something his mother said, watching the sunlight catch in her hair, feeling the absolute rightness of her beside him, Edward understood what he had been too frightened to see. Vulnerability was not weakness. It was the only path to joy. And he would spend the rest of his life grateful that Clara Hartley had been patient enough, strong enough, brave enough to wait for him to discover it.